Welcome, and thank you for joining me once again for another quiet journey into the distant corners of the past. Wherever you are, you can take a slow, calming breath and let it go. Allow your body to settle, your mind to soften, and the rhythms of the day to drift further behind you. Tonight, we find ourselves not in a palace or a grand Roman bath, not amidst senators or philosophers, but behind heavy stone walls, among the clang of iron, the slow shuffle of sandaled feet, and the dull weight of discipline. This is not the story of glory, not really. It's the quieter, grimmer path, walked by a man who trained others to die. In ancient Rome, amid the empire's vast appetite for spectacle, but while the crowd chanted for blood and the emperors issued decrees from gilded balconies, the trainers, the doctors, labored in shadows. What was it like to be one of them? Tonight, we'll explore that question, not through the eyes of a roaring crowd or a conquering general, but through the slow, grinding life of a gladiator trainer in the Roman ludus. Let's begin. The sun just beginning to rise over the tiled rooftops of Capua, or perhaps Rome itself. You are not a nobleman. You are not free to rest. You are already awake, because your men are. The ludus, the gladiator training school, stirs like a beast just beginning to wake. Beneath the wooden awnings and enclosed courtyards, dozens of men, some muscled, others scarred. Chains clink faintly. Bare feet scuff against the dust. You are there, Dr. Armoroom, their weapons master. But they do not look at you with admiration. They do not cheer when you approach. Some fear you, some hate you. Many have already buried their old lives and blame you for what comes next. The daily routine is unforgiving, almost ritualistic in its repetition. First, stretching, not gentle, but harsh forced flexibility that prevents injury and maintains control. A strained ligament could cost a man his life in the arena, or yours in reputation. Then, the drills begin. Wooden swords, rudizar, thrust into calloused hands. They are heavier than real swords, meant to exhaust the limbs, to turn motion into memory. The men are not allowed to stop. Not until the sweat runs down their backs like rivulets down a statue after rain. Over and over. Out corrections. A faltered movement means punishment. A repeated error means pain. There is no margin for weakness. In the center of the yard stands the palisa wooden post worn smooth from years of strikes. Each trainee takes a turn. They circle it, attacking it with blade and shield, until their shoulders shake and their breath comes in gasps. These aren't games. This is survival rehearsal, and all the while you watch. Who might last long enough to earn a name in the arena, and who is already a ghost walking? Injuries are common. Bones crack, muscles tear. Dislocated joints must be snapped back into place with precision. There is no trained physician always on hand. Often, that job falls to you as well alongside the blacksmithing, armor fitting, and psychological conditioning. Imagine setting a broken rib beneath the same torchlight you use to sharpen blades. Food is functional, but sparse. Barley, gruel, lentils, sometimes meat for the more promising fighters. Not luxury, but just enough to build bulk. Between drills, the men are ordered to maintain their gear. Shields are repaired, leather bindings rewound, helmets polished, though they will be stained with blood again soon. This keeps hands busy, not with scolding, but with floggings, isolation, or worse. Runaways are branded or made examples of before the others. There are no second chances. You must maintain absolute control. The men around you are not actors, they are trained weapons, breathing liabilities. If they smell weakness, you may not wake the next morning. Some trainers resort to psychological tactics, selecting favorites to stoke jealousy, pairing bitter rivals in drills, breaking friendships before they form. The more isolated the trainees, the less likely they are to organize, to rebel, to remember that they are many and you are few. And still, amid all this, you begin to care, not for all of them, but for a few, faster than the others. The old German who lost his tongue in battle but fights like a lion. The ex-legionary whose eyes hold to many ghosts. You see their progress. You feel responsible. And then, one by one, they begin to leave the ludus. For the arena, you stand in the training yard, watching the gates close behind them. And when they return, if they return, they are never quite the same. Some come back with coins, others with scars, a few not at all. You learn to hide your grief, to start again the next morning. The crowd only sees the show, not the cost in time. You no longer hear the screams from the training yard. You no longer blink when a trainee collapses mid. You simply walk over, assess the body, and call for another to take his place. This is the rhythm of your life. Day by day, strike by strike, you sculpt men into weapons, knowing that each blade you forge may one day cut through your legacy or your throat. But your duties extend beyond the yard. There is more to being a doctor than drills and discipline. Let us now to the markets, the auctions, the ships docking in the port, where human lives are weighed, traded, and sometimes discarded. Asterisk, asterisk. By now, you've seen the dust and discipline of the Ludus the Gladiator training school, inked in contracts, whispered in corners, and calculated in coin. You were not just a trainer, you were a merchant, a manager. Tunic, smelling faintly of leather and sweat as you head toward the slave market, not for a casual inspection, but to restock your ranks. The games in Capua are 2 months away, and you've already lost 3 of your most promising men, 1 to fever, 1 to a shattered leg, and 1 to another trainer's bribe. You need fresh blood. Literally. The slave market of Romor, perhaps one of the provincial auctions in Ephesus or Galiz, no bustling bazaar. It's quiet in a transactional sort of way. Rows of chained bodies, some defiant, others slumped, waiting for the roll of fate. You listen to the sellers, many of whom inflate backstories, the way a fisherman speaks of a catch. This one fought a bear with his bare hands, they might whisper, or he's Numidian fierce, like a lion, perfect for the arena. You nod, but you know better. You've bought enough men to recognize the signs, the sun'll limp, and you know that for every 10 you buy, 2 might make it to the arena. 1 might win, the rest will die in your sandpit training. Coin changes hands, tallies are recorded. If you're lucky, you have a Lanista business agent who handles the numbers and negotiations while you watch from a distance. But most trainers, especially in the provinces, did it all themselves. There were connections to maintain, warlords to pay off, governors to flatter. Some trainers even bartered favors. For flesh-hovering guards, coin for access to condemned men before they reached execution. If you were lucky, A governor might hand you a batch of thieves or rebels en masse. Slowly injured another gladiator before his first real match. Your best fighter beheaded in the first blow. Or worse, a mutiny sparked in the barracks because one new recruit dared to question your authority. For that, if one fighter didn't suit your training methods, perhaps another school could use him. From this supply chain, if anything, their stakes were higher. Their fighters had to perform, had to impress, and if they didn't single quotes, heads rolled. Not just metaphorically, the constant buying, trading, and managing of human lives made you numb after a while, detached. Some trainers drank heavily, others turned to gambling, throwing the coin they earned from slave sales back into the pit of risk. And yet, beneath it all was the quiet knowledge that every man you bought was a future corpse. Some sooner, some later, but none escaped, not truly. You were feeding the furnace. The arena didn't demand skill as much as it demanded bodies. You were offering up meat to the machine. Still, you continued, because to stop was to fall behind, to lose your favor, to become obsolete. And in Rome, obsolete meant forgotten. Forgotten meant dead. But even the best-sourced men, even the most carefully trained fighters, could turn the tide against Uzams in ways no trainer could prepare for. And with that unsettling thought, a man who shook the foundations of the empire itself, now, Allow your mind to drift to Capua. The sun is warm against the terracotta roofs. In southern Italy, one of the most prestigious ludi in the empire, and here is where a single ember of defiance would flare into a blaze. Spartacus, too many Romans, a Thracian mercenary turned prisoner, a trained fighter who, like all the others, was meant to die under the roar of a crowd. And yet, he didn't. He escaped. But from a trainer's perspective, Spartacus wasn't a legend. He was a catastrophe, the embodiment of every fear you quietly harbored, but dared not speak aloud. Imagine yourself as one of the instructors at the ludus of Lentulus Batiatus, the school where Spartacus was kept. You knew his strength, his tactical mind. You noticed how his eyes scanned not just people but plans. He listened carefully. Of training had broken his will to resist. But Spartacus had not been broken. He was learning, watching, waiting. He wasn't alone, of course. Gladiator schools were filled with tension, with kitchen knives, not swords or spears, not armor. Then, as they made their way out of the school, they seized proper weapons. Swords meant for performance, shields meant for show. The rebellion swelled. It wasn't just a dozen desperate men fleeing into the countryside. It became an army of former slaves, gladiators, deserters, and those with nothing left to lose. For trainers, it was terrifying. You must understand the implications. It meant that trained killers, men forged by your very routines and methods, were now out in the wild, using the skills you gave them. Against you, in Rome's eyes, Spartacus became a threat to the Republic. Had you watched them closely enough? Did they whisper in their bunks at night? Did one glance too long at the lock on the gate? Some took to chaining their men at night. Others hired guards, not for the perimeter, but for themselves. Worse still, the Spartacus rebellion lasted for years. Roman legions were routed, and at every turn, Spartacus reminded you, the line between slave and soldier is perilously thin. The fear was no longer just about losing fighters in the. They changed routines, taught loyalty through reward, not just punishment. But the fear lingered. Imagine the psychological toll. Every new recruit could be the next spark. Every shared meal could be a conspiracy. And as Rome escalated its military response, trainers were quietly questioned, interrogated. Some were accused of negligence, others of complicity. When Spartacus and his army were finally defeated brutally, with risk, and yet Spartacus had not just trained in your methods. He had proven something more dangerous than even the most controlled. Most days, your greatest threat wasn't a war. Strong, desperate, and trained to kill, not for politics. Settle in now. The torches flicker along the stone walls of the ludus. You've heard the familiar shuffle of sandaled feet on gravel, the clang of chains, the low thud of wooden swords against flesh and leather. It's night again, and the men sleep behind their barred doors. Or so you hope. But you've learned not to be too sure. Because every man inside this building, every fighter you've trained, punished, fed, and shouted ATIs, a killer. A killer by trade, by training, by sheer necessity. And the truth settles slowly into your chest. You've turned dozens, even hundreds, of men into weapons. Weapons you cannot always control. Imagine yourself walking past their cells at night. You carry a torch. You hear breathing, whispers, sometimes nothing at all. You don't know if silence is a comforter, a warning. Some trainers kept dogs. Others carried knives tucked into their belts, even during mealtime. A few slept with trusted guards stationed at their doors. Because while the arena was a stage for Roman glory, the ludus was a pressure cooker, enclosed, tense, heavy with resentment. Even minor infractions could fester. A missed meal, a punishment that went too far, a mocking remark, the pain of the wooden rudies striking the same bruise again and again. These things weren't forgotten easily, especially by men with little else to lose. There are stories, quiet ones, usually spoken only in hushed tones, of what happened when a trainer let his guard down. One such tale comes from a school in Sicily. The Lanista, a former legionary, was known for cruelty. His punishments were creative and public. He humiliated his fighters for mistakes, broke their fingers when they failed drills, and denied water as a lesson in obedience. One night, a group of men pretended to fight among themselves, drawing the guards into their cells. When the door opened, they struck not with swords, but with shackles, bone and hands hardened like mallets. The Lanista never made it to morning. And then there was the case in Hispania, where a trainer was poisoned all at once, but gradually, a few drops in his wine each night, until his hands trembled and he could barely stand. By the time he suspected the cause, he was too weak to defend himself. No one ever confessed. No one needed to. The fear wasn't always of open rebellion. It was of quiet revenge, because you, the trainer, held power over men who no longer believed they had anything left to lose. They knew pain. They had seen death. They lived beside it. And though most dreamed of survival lore, at the very least, a clean end in the arena, some dreamed instead of turning the tables. A few gladiators became favorites. Perhaps you gave one a longer rest, allowed another a second portion of food. Sometimes a fighter would earn your trust, become a kind of lieutenant, helping to manage the others. But even those relationships were brittle. One wrong word, one moment of perceived betrayal, and trust could curdle into hatred. There were those who plotted for weeks, others who acted in sudden fury, and the most chilling part, you might never know which one it would be. That's why the ludus was designed like a fortress. The cells were locked from the outside. Weapons were kept in locked racks, counted before and after every session. Trainers rarely stood with their backs to the men. Even sparring matches were watched closely, not for cheating, but for opportunity. A wooden sword, swung hard enough, could crush a skull. Some Lanistas grew paranoid. Understandably so. They ordered surprise searches, interrogated their own men, banned visitors, watched the cooks and water carriers with suspicion. Even fellow staff were sometimes considered a threat, because all it took was one guard, one assistant, one disloyal tutor to unlock a door at the wrong time, and everything you built could collapse. Not every school experienced open revolt. Most didn't, but the possibility loomed like smoke from a fire you couldn't see, and so you lived in a peculiar tension. You taught these men to fight, encouraged them to be ruthless, praised them for power and cunning, and then you feared them for the very same reasons. There's a strange contradiction there, isn't there? You were their mentor, their taskmaster, sometimes even their caregiver, but never their friend, because the moment you believed one of them might care for you in return was often the moment you forgot to check the door, or the food, or the silence. Still, the ludus had to go on. You had to train. The crowds would still come, cheering for the blood and spectacle. And for every match, every triumph, every coin earned, there was still that quiet understanding. You had built a world of violence, and violence always remembers its makers. Let your breath slow now, as we step away from the dangers inside the ludus, and instead wander among the ruins. Carvings, stones, names forgotten by time, because not all gladiators vanished in blood and sand. Some left traces, strangely tender ones. Asterisk, asterisk, let us now drift gently, away from the clang of training swords, away from the torchlit corridors of the ludus, and out into the stillness of ancient graveyards, where time no longer races and stories rest beneath stone. Imagine yourself walking through a dusty field outside a once great Roman city, perhaps Capua, or maybe Ephesus. The sunlight is soft. The breeze carries the smell of baked earth and dried grass. Between your feet, scattered among crumbling columns and weathered stones, lie the resting places of men once cheered by thousands. Gladiators. You might expect their tombs to be unmarked, anonymous, forgotten, but they are not. Their names, in fact, are carved into stone, their victories counted, their professions declared. Many died in silence, claimed by the arena and discarded without ceremony. But for others, those who lived long enough to earn fame or wealth or even freedom, there were tombstones. And these stones speak in soft but steady voices. You might find one for a man named Flama, a celebrated Syrian-born gladiator who fought 34 times. The stone says he won 21 of those matches, was granted the wooden sword of freedom 4 times, but refused it. He chose to return to the arena again and again, dying at the age of 30. Why he refused freedom is a mystery that has never been fully answered. Some say he had nothing outside the arena. Others believe he had become something inside it, not a slave, but a legend. Then there's Crescens, a retiarius, or net fighter. His epitaph was placed by a woman, a wife, perhaps, or a patroness. It reads, not of blood, but of sorrow. She mourned him as gentle in life, even as his job had been to stab and snare. The stone tells us he died young, but it also tells us he was loved. And in another corner of the empire, near a dusty track in modern-day Turkey, there lies a tomb of a gladiator named Dexios, whose tombstone features a carved relief. In the image, he stands, trident in hand, facing a cedar below, a line of text records that he won 8 matches before falling in his 9th. No boast, no bitterness, just a record, a life remembered. What surprises many, as these graves are unearthed, is the richness of detail, the pride in profession, and the quiet traces of humanity. Some gladiators had wives, children. There are tombs that list names of sons, or thank a spouse for loyalty. There are epitaphs that mention friendships formed inside the ludus, or bonds with fellow fighters that carried meaning beyond bloodshed. And yet, among all this, there's a curious absence. Very few tombstones speak of the lanista, the trainer, the master. You would think that, for all the time these men spent under the eye of their instructors day after day, year after year, there would be more mentions, a word of thanks or a curse. But instead, there's silence, a space left blank, perhaps. It's because the bond between gladiator and trainer was not one of affection. Perhaps it was not worth remembering, or perhaps those who earned the privilege of a tombstone, those who could speak, at last, for themselves chose to speak only of who they were, not who had made them. And there is something solemn in that. Some of these graves, too, bear symbols. A palm frond marking victory, a trident and net, a short sword. Occasionally, you'll see inscriptions boasting of how many opponents the fighter killed. These weren't just tombs, they were resumes, advertisements for the afterlife. A final nod to a life lived under watchful eyes. Archaeologists have found tombs where multiple gladiators are buried side by side, comrades who perhaps fell in the same match. Some are buried close to amphitheaters, others in common grounds used by veterans. And in one instance, a tomb was found for a doctora gladiator trainer who was once a champion himself. His stone records not his teachings, but his personal triumphs. As if even in death, the title of trainer meant less than the legacy of a fighter. There's also the curious matter of freedmen slaves who earned their freedom, then chose to remain in the gladiator world. Some became instructors, others simply stayed close to the games. Their tombs often reflect this strange in-between status. Not quite slave, not quite noble, proud yet cautious. These stones, these carvings, and epitaphs, they remind us that even in a world ruled by violence, humanity lingered. There were bonds formed, memories cherished, losses mourned, and perhaps that's the most surprising part of all, that beneath the dust of centuries, in the shadow of the Colosseums, we find not just records of demise, but whispers of love, loyalty, and longing, the kind that drift into the silence of night and sleep like we do now beside the soft earth. Let us remain still for a moment. Now let's drift upward again, out of the quiet graveyards, into the roaring heart of the Roman arena, where the sun is blazing, the marble seats are crowded, and the scent of perfume mixes strangely with sweat and dust. You are no longer in the training yard or in the tombs. You are in the stands of power. The Colosseum rises around you like a giant crown of stone. At its peak, an awning called the Valerium ripples gently to block the harsh Roman sun. But you are seated well below that, perhaps in a private box. You wear fine linen, your sandals are polished, and at your side is a goblet of spiced wine. You are part of the elite, senators, governors, high-ranking military officers, the wealthy wives of magistrates. You do not fight in the arena. You own the arena. You sponsor it, fund it, applaud it, and most of all, you use it. The games are not just entertainment. They are a chessboard of influence. Who you cheer for, who you bet on, who you invite to sit beside you, these things matter. Newly elected official might sponsor a grand set of games to earn favor with the mob. A general back from campaign might parade captured prisoners through the streets before sentencing them to die in the arena. Lavish, brutal generosity, and the audience is always ready. At midday, when the executions begin, when prisoners, not gladiators, are sent in to be killed by beasts or blades, the senators eat lunch, lavishly roast, peacock, stuffed dormice, honeyed figs, and glazed boar. This was not a grim affair, not a time for silence or mourning. It was theater, politics, spectacle. The midday executions, often the bloodiest part of the day, were oddly casual. A criminal might be tied to a stake and left for a lion, or placed in a reenactment of a myth dressed as Icarus, for example, before being hurled from a great height. A macabre sense of drama hung over everything, and while this happened, the upper crust dined. They passed dishes around. They gossiped about alliances. They speculated about who would be running for consul next year. Some even discussed real estate while men bled below them. Others placed bets. Gambling was rampant among the Roman elite. A favorite gladiator was not just a warrior, but an investment, one that could gain value or lose it with a single stroke. And then there were the patrons. Wealthy Romans who adopted a gladiator, sponsored his career, hosted dinners in his honor, or used his fame to bolster their own. Think of it like a sports agent, a personal PR manager, and a fan all rolled into one. These patrons often wore their gladiators' colors. They would commission mosaics, sponsor statues, and even host private sparring matches in their villas for visiting dignitaries. It was fashionable, it was exciting, and sometimes it was scandalous. There are stories, mostly whispered, of upper-class Roman women falling in love with gladiators, risking shame and status to pursue them. The poet Juvenal mocked these affairs in verse, calling them madness. But the rumors persisted. Some were likely true. It wasn't just the women. Some powerful men had similar obsessions, whether with the thrill of violence, the allure of control, or something more intimate. Gladiators were exotic, dangerous, admired. Their muscles bore scars. Their names, once unknown, became common in the streets. But for the elite, this admiration was always laced with power. Gladiators were not equals. They were property, tools, toys to be enjoyed or discarded. And if one lost too many matches, well, there were always more to buy, more to train, more to kill. The lanista if you were one, had to keep the noble crowd entertained. One bad fight, and you might be ignored. 2, and you might be ridiculed. 3, your fighters would be seen as weak, and so would you. Your reputation could crumble faster than a broken helmet. And yet, for every elite who watched with detachment, there were others who truly admired the fighters, who treated them with a twisted sort of respect, who believed that true strength was found not in wealth, but in surviving the arena. These elites might toast a champion, commission a mural, even speak their name at dinner parties, but never too loudly, and never too often, because gladiators, in the end, were always expendable. The arena served the empire, but it also served the ego, and so the wine flowed, the peacocks were carved, the lions were loosed, and the Roman elite, watching from their marbled seats, cheered for death and plotted for life. And now, let us slowly turn from those cheering crowds. Let the dust settle, let the screams fade. Asterisk, asterisk, and now the arena is empty. The crowds are gone. The blood on the sand has dried to dust. Let your breath slow, let your thoughts quiet. We are leaving Rome now, not in the blaze of its glory, but in the soft flicker of its twilight. The empire is crumbling. Invasions, rebellions, famine, plague. The golden statues are melting down into coins, and the marble pillars are cracking under their own weight. The Colosseum still stands, but its shows are fewer now. The beasts grow harder to import, the crowds less willing to cheer for slaughter, and the Lanista begins to vanish, not all at once, not in a single event, but gradually like smoke escaping from a cracked amphora. As Christianity spread through Rome, the games began to fall out of favor. No longer were gladiators seen as heroic martyrs of strength. They were seen as pagans, as symbols of a violent, godless past. The church called for mercy, for dignity, for peace, and for an end to the games. Emperors tried to resist. Some even revived the arena briefly to hold on to power. But the world was changing. The Roman people no longer looked to sand and blood for glory. They looked to scripture, to saints, to heaven, and the Lanista, once feared and respected, was no longer welcome in this new world. Records about them were not carefully preserved. They were not honored in tombs or carved into triumphal arches. They were not made saints. They were not remembered in prayers. In fact, few Roman writers even mentioned them by name. Historians wrote about emperors, about battles, about gods, but not about the men who trained slaves to die for sport. The word Lanista itself faded into silence. What happened to them? Some may have vanished into other trades. Others may have died poor as the arenas emptied and fortunes dried up. A few, perhaps, tried to reinvent themselves, offering private security or training soldiers instead of gladiators. But history is clear about one thing: they were not remembered kindly. The church called them corrupters of souls. Philosophers called them merchants of cruelty. Even those who once dined beside them began to deny they ever had. They became ghosts, not noble enough to be mourned, not wicked enough to be burned in legend, just forgotten. But here, tonight, you have remembered them. You walked their halls. You stood in their sand. You heard the cheers and the screams and the silence that followed. So now, as sleep draws near, let the Colosseum crumble behind your closed eyes. Let the names fade once more into the dust. And if you dream tonight of the roar of lions or the clang of swords or a crowd rising to its feet. Know that you have seen a shadow the world tried to forget, a world where death was business, and the Lanista held the keys. You've reached the end of tonight's tale. May your sleep be deep, and may your dreams be quiet. If you found this journey interesting or calming, please consider subscribing for more sleepy stories from forgotten corners of history. Good night, sleep well, and may your mind drift gently, far from the roar of the crowd.